So here we are with the second entry in the second wave of the adult fairy tale genre. Now, while Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters was catered to an adult audience with its Tarantino approach, this film is unapologetically tailored to the more marketable, more lucrative PG-13 crowd. And that's a demographic that director Bryan Singer is all too familiar with. For those of you who don't know, Bryan Singer is the guy who brought the X-Men to the silver screen, directed the first two movies, and then also directed Superman Returns. We all saw it, we all have our opinions about it. So, yeah. With that said, let's get started with this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. We all know the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, so there's quite a few things in this film that are fairly predictable. And it doesn't help the fact that this film hits a lot of the same dramatic beats that a lot of fantasy action-adventure films made in the past few decades tend to hit. However, to the film's credit, it at least hits those beats in the way that they're supposed to be. It kind of does those tropes, it implements them in the way that they're supposed to be used, rather than just putting them in for the sake of putting them in and having them feel forced. Just kind of a case of, okay, well, here's how the stories usually play out, so we're going to do this right. That said, although it's predictable, it at least does it in a way that shows that the screenwriters actually knew what they were doing and weren't just implementing stuff for the sake of implementing stuff, with some exceptions which I will discuss later. Now, the two biggest drawbacks that I noticed with this film were in the case of costuming and the animation of the giants. Now, with the costuming, there's literally this one character whose costume just absolutely bothers me. I mean, you've got all these other characters, they're dressed up like medieval knights in medieval Europe. They make a lot of allusions that this is supposed to be like medieval England. They even give the place the name Albion. I don't know the significance of that. The only time I've ever really heard Albion has been once in Soul Calibur and another in the various Fable games. But I know it has something to do with like British lore and stuff to a point, but they kind of imply that it's medieval England. And then you just have this character whose entire design, his armor and his helmet, I mean his helmet's a frickin' Kaiser helmet. I mean, they designed his armor, and at least they had the full thing designed to match the helmet, but the helmet's a Kaiser helmet. They pretty much designed him like a World War I Kaiser Baron person, sort of, because he's got the Kaiser helmet, although they don't have like the spike thing, they've got kind of some other thing, and then he's also got a frickin' monocle. I mean, what? What? One, it clashes with the color scheme of a lot of the costumes of the generals and the knights in the film, and it also clashes culturally with the way the world was set up. I mean, you've got all these other people wearing like traditional like knight stuff. Although they do take their own creative liberties and create their own unique look, it's just kind of a case where it implies that it's taking cues from medieval England and to a lesser extent, medieval France. But then you've got this guy with a freaking Kaiser helmet and a monocle. It makes no sense. It makes no sense! The second drawback was with the animation of the giants. Now, for the most part, they're very well designed. I get that they're not supposed to be very appealing. They're supposed to be kind of like, ugh, they're the villains. They're kind of gross and ugh, and scary. But there were times in the film that the way they were animated, it was a little too cartoony. They put a little too many of the gross out humor antics. And it really felt like they were just trying to put those in there to appeal to the younger viewers that are going to be seeing this film. That's pretty much how it felt, is that it was put in there to appeal to the much younger crowd. Kind of the same crowd that they put Jar Jar in to appeal to. Although not that bad. It's not Jar Jar bad. But it just was kind of a case of, okay, I see what you're doing here. This is just pandering to a younger audience. It didn't really take me out of the story. It just felt kind of unnecessary. Now, speaking of the cartoony, pandering antics, there were also some other comedic parts in the film that most of the comedic parts were pretty good, but some of them fell a little flat. Now, a lot of it may just be a reaction, because a lot of the bits that I felt were kind of flat were the ones they showed in the trailer, so this may just be a reaction of having seen those jokes already. I'm just like, okay, I already saw it. Wasn't really funny the first time I saw it in the trailer, so yeah. They showed some of the best parts that were probably the best parts in the script, but they showed it in the trailer and the TV spots, and so it kind of ruins it. Now, there's not really much else to say from a technical standpoint, because it's pretty par for the course. The only things I can really comment on is that the film It has pretty good acting. I mean, you get some nice quips from Ewan McGregor's performance, and Nicholas Hoult does come across as a pretty convincing lead. I mean, he's got the farm boy bit down, and it was kind of weird getting used to his acting style, because I mean, again, I previously saw him in Warm Bodies, but I found he grew on me. I found him believable. Okay, I can believe this person is a farm boy. He's someone who isn't like from the upper crust. He's someone that's pretty much the everyman role that they always try to put in these films that kind of carries the viewer through the story. And so Nicholas Hoult did a really good job playing that role, being that lead. Now in the case of the music, this is one thing I noticed with a lot of standalone fantasy films, or just fantasy films in general that are trying to compete or make a name for themselves, that they model their scores to copy either Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. And that's what this score felt like. Had a lot of the reoccurring themes and like motif stuff, even though for a huge chunk of the film the score was fairly silent, but particularly during the credits and during like huge swells, they try to like have repeated themes and like saying, hey, we have the same theme again, almost kind of trying to copy Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. That said, it feels too much like a copy of other scores, and it doesn't really bring anything unique or memorable to it. It was like they played the different variations of the theme without actually giving us the main theme. That's what it felt like. So overall, the film is still pretty entertaining. It's just a case that you kind of gotta know what you're getting into. I mean, don't expect to see stuff like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. This is definitely geared towards a much younger audience. And so if you go in and kind of expecting the cheesiness and the predictability and just kind of go in expecting to see kind of the cool action scenes and the cool fantasy stuff, you'll enjoy it. But it's not a film I'd really recommend rushing out to see in theaters right away. You're better off waiting until it gets to the dollar theaters, or if you're babysitting some kids or having to watch some kids. It's a good film for kids who are kind of like 10, 15, maybe like 7, 8 years old at the youngest. But it's definitely kind of for that typical like slightly older but still considered a kid demographic. With that said, on my personal scale, I'm giving Jack the Giant Slayer a 3.5 out of 5. Again, it's enjoyable. It does have some goofiness to it, and the costume thing was a little bit annoying, but for the most part, it's a decent film. You just don't need to rush out to see it. So that's it for this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. As for next week, I'll be taking a look at Oz the Great and Powerful. See you then.